Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a pretty rare and totally unfiltered conversation with the president. Now, this isn't some planned speech. It's what's called a press gaggle, and it was held in one of the most exclusive press rooms you can imagine aboard Air Force One.
So, let's dive right in. First off, what exactly is a press gaggle? Well, as you can see, it's definitely not your typical formal press conference. It's on the record, sure, but it's way more spontaneous. The whole point of this kind of informal setting is to get those candid, unfiltered responses, and let me tell you, this one really delivered on that front.
You know, the setting itself is a huge part of the story here. I mean, just think about it. They're on the president's official plane, flying thousands of feet in the air. This creates a really unique dynamic. Everything is super fast-paced, super direct, and they cover a ton of ground, both literally and figuratively, in a really short amount of time.
And the range of topics they covered was just staggering. In just a few minutes, you'll see the conversation just leaps from international diplomacy all the way to domestic policy, then over to personal legal battles and even some pretty surprising architectural plans. So to make sense of it all, we've broken this explainer down by theme.
First up, let's talk about international relations. This part of the conversation was like a rapid-fire tour through some of the world's biggest geopolitical hotspots, and what the president had to say was, well, pretty revealing.
So when he's asked about Iran, the response is this really fascinating mix of military muscle and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. On one hand, he's pointed to this major naval presence, but on the other, he makes it a point to say that, hey, they are talking to us, seriously. It's kind of like a classic carrot-and-stick approach, all in one sentence.
And from there, the discussion just pivots over to Venezuela. Here, it's all about this really optimistic take on a potential oil deal. He frames it as a win-win, saying the U.S. would take some and Venezuela would take a lot, and he throws in some praise for the country's current leadership for good measure.
Now, when it comes to China, a couple of really distinct points came up. First, there's this clear concern about a potential Chinese deal happening up in Canada, which he actually calls a takeover. And second, you get this very direct statement on China's power structure, where he basically affirms President Xi as the singular authority, or as he puts it, the one boss.
So, when the topic of Cuba comes up, the president paints this picture of a country that's really in economic trouble, pointing out they've got no money and no oil. And he kind of suggests that this economic pressure is what creates an opening for a deal, with the stated goal being to let Cuban Americans finally go back home.
And to wrap up this little world tour, we land in Greenland. He straight up confirms that, yep, negotiations are happening for what he calls a very, very important deal. And what's really interesting is how he frames it. He says it's all about national security.
All right, so let's shift gears now and bring it back from the world stage to what's happening right here at home. The conversation also hit on several key domestic policies.
When it came to his pick for the Fed, the president was actually really candid about what he personally wanted, saying he hoped for lower interest rates. But he was also super quick to draw a line in the sand, right? Making it totally clear this wasn't some kind of quid pro quo by saying, point blank, no commitments.
Okay, now let's talk crime rates for a second, because a very specific, and I mean very bold, number came up in the conversation. It's a number the president used to frame his whole record on law and order.
And there it is. I mean, this is a huge claim, right? The president is asserting that crime, and specifically the murder rate, is at its lowest point in 125 years. He even repeats it for emphasis. It's a powerful number, and for sure a statistic that grabs your attention.
So when they ask him about funding for the Department of Homeland Security, he doesn't really commit to anything. Instead, he lays out these three specific demands he says are coming from the Democrats, things about patrols, use of force, and masks. So basically, his response was to kind of kick the can down the road, saying they'd talk about it in a few days.
And then the conversation turns to the protests against ICE, and this is where you get a really direct and pretty controversial statement. He says that in response to things like spitting or punching, law enforcement is allowed to hit back with an equal or greater consequence. It's a pretty clear green light for a forceful response.
All right, from public policy, the conversation suddenly takes this sharp turn into the personal. We're talking active lawsuits and even some, well, surprisingly ambitious building projects.
Okay, so this next part is maybe one of the weirdest moments of the whole thing. There's a lawsuit about a break-in at Mar-a-Lago that was filed before he was president, which means he's now on both sides of the case, which, led a reporter to ask a question you probably don't hear every day. How in the world do you settle a lawsuit with yourself?
And believe it or not, here's the proposed solution to this legal brain teaser. To get out of this bizarre situation of basically suing himself, the president suggests he'll work out the settlement by just giving a bunch of money to some established charities.
The president also got really passionate when he started describing his vision for a massive new arch in Washington, D.C. He compares it directly to the famous Arc de Triomphe in Paris, but he makes his own ambition for the American version crystal clear. I'd like it to be the biggest one of all. Then he pivots and directly addresses a lawsuit connected to Jeffrey Epstein, and he comes out swinging, right? He claims that new information doesn't just clear his name, it does the opposite, and he says it actually implicates a writer named Wolf in a conspiracy against him, which then leads him to float the idea of a potential countersuit.
Okay, so after that absolute whirlwind tour through global affairs, domestic policy, and all these personal projects, what does a conversation like this actually tell us? Let's zoom out and look at the big picture takeaways.
You know, more than any single thing he said, it's the sheer range of topics that gives you this incredible snapshot of what's on the administration's mind. It shows you a list of priorities where global deal-making, domestic policy, and even personal legal fights and building plans all seem to blend together. It's like getting a direct, unfiltered look at the president's entire focus on that one particular day.
And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about, right? In a world where every political message is so carefully scripted and managed, what's the real value of something like this totally unfiltered conversation? What does this kind of stream of consciousness access really tell us about policy, about personality, and about power? Thanks for joining us for this explainer.